welcome to the ACT branch of the AIIA. My name's Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And in case you're wondering, I'm not actually auditioning as lead singer for AC/DC. It's just the result of a minor surgical procedure this morning. Now, last month we heard from the Institute for Peace Building at Melbourne University about the role of the United Nations in pursuing global peace and security. Tonight we're having a look at the international response to humanitarian crises in developing countries. We'll be asking how international organisations can forge sustainable and equitable solutions for global development in a disrupted world, whether as a result of climate change, regional conflict, or COVID-19. And we'll discuss what role Australian non-government development assistance organisations can play in promoting poverty amelioration, especially in the Pacific, in our region. To lead the discussion, we're delighted to have with us tonight Marc Purcell, the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development, which is the peak body for Australian NGOs in international development and humanitarian action. Marc has a wealth of experience in the community, international development and human rights sectors in Australia. He has worked as Oxfam Australia's National Advocacy Manager and was Executive Officer for the Catholic Commission for Justice, Development and Peace. He's also worked as Country Program Manager for Africa of Australian Volunteers International and with UNHCR in Nepal, assisting Tibetan refugees. Marc is a Director of the Community Council for Australia and has served on the boards of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust, the National Roundtable of Non-Profit Organisations, the Refugee Immigration Legal Centre, Just Australia, and last but not least, Catholic Social Services Victoria. Now, Marc is joined tonight by Alan Hewson, who is ACFID's Policy and Partnerships Lead. Alan has held roles in DFAT, the International Labour Organisation, and the Queensland Government. Now, as per our normal format, Marc will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from participants in-house and from those of you online, using the Q&A function, please, on Zoom. Now, we aim to finish at 7 p.m. So, without any further ado, over to Marc.
Thanks, Heath, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here for Alan and I in Australia's, the ACT chapter of Australia's oldest and most important think tank. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to move over here so that I'm not standing in front of the presentation. Hopefully, folks up online, good evening. You can see both me and the presentation. We've just got this as a bit of a prop because there's some facts and figures, but we're going to whiz through a bit of a smorgasbord and do some tasters, looking at a bit of the context for the Australian aid program, why it goes up, why it goes down, which many of you will have worked in government and possibly DFAT over the years, so you probably have more insight than us and lived experience, but a little bit of the framing of the work that we do to try and help make aid and development salient at the time as ACFID, and the work of our members, the campaigning we do. And then Alan is going to take over and talk about current policy settings, the development policy that the government launched last August, and then talk about the current inquiry that the Parliament has into Australia's relationship with Pacific. And of course, it's the Gulf Foreign Leaders meeting. So we're going to skim across this because we know you're all very well informed. So we thought that the quicker we do this, the more we get into questions and answers and discussion. So Heath, you're going to whip me along. But when I was a boy, I come from Melbourne, and down at Half Moon Bay, Black Rock, there is the half-submerged carcass of the HMS Cerberus, which, for those of you that have been down there, come from Melbourne, will know, it was commissioned by the colony of Victoria because of the Crimean War, and was to defend the colony, which was having booming goldfields, of course. It's revenue streaming in. And it arrived 30 years later in the 1880s, and it was a unique ironclad boat because it was semi-submersible to make it less of a target, but unfortunately it was incredibly unstable, and so it couldn't really, everyone got seasick on it, and it wasn't very manoeuvrable, and so it was scuttled down Half Moon Bay. And I thought that was apt because it sort of has sort of a strange presence for AUKUS. But really what I wanted to say was that Alan Gingell, the esteemed leader, president of AIIA for many years, of course, coined the term fear of abandonment, and that's driving Australia's security posture very much at the moment in AUKUS. And I think it's relevant to framing Australia's overseas development assistance now because it needs to be seen in that context. And as Curtin turned towards the US in 1941 and focused in on the struggle in the Pacific, I think now we can see the salience too with the current leadership and Penny Wong and Senator Birmingham also putting an emphasis on the need for Australia to listen to the Pacific and the struggle for influence in a larger geostrategic struggle between the ascendant PRC, possibly, depending on elections in November, a retracting US power in the Pacific. And so this is very, very real. This is the context that aid, Australia's official development assistance, is being delivered in. And we like to think of aid now in the official context is in the 3Ds of development, diplomacy and defence. And very much ACFID has sought over the last 5 years to position the official aid program as being equally important as defence and development, not least because it's a very substantial part of DFAT's budget, 4.9 billion, but next financial year will go in across 5 billion for the first time in a decade, which was the last time it was that figure in 2013. And it's very important in terms of helping the region in terms of investments in stability, obviously economic development, prosperity, but also relationally. It's about people-to-people linkages as well and what we can achieve with that in terms of the programs that we cooperate on around both common problems that countries in our region have, but also specific needs that they might have. And then finally, it's also very important because we're the 13th largest economy still in the world. But as we'll see, we're not really playing our way. So the vexed history of Australian aid is that it really goes up when prime ministers harness it to the national interest. And so you might recall that John Howard, in the wake of the catastrophe of the Asian tsunami, actually used the aid program, an incredibly generous mixture of grant aid and loans, $1 billion to Indonesia specifically in 2005-06 in the wake of the Boxing Day tsunami. But he also used it to repair fractured relationships with elites in Jakarta in the wake of Australia supporting the referendum for independence of Timor-Leste and its subsequent independence. And that had sour relations with Australia at that point in time. And so by utilising Australia's humanitarian assistance, helping Aceh reconstruct, we actually did a lot of practical assistance, rebuilding, but also a lot to generate goodwill. And I remember when President Jokowi came here in February 2020 and spoke to Parliament, he went straight to that assistance package, but then also noted that Indonesian firemen had come over to assist Australia in the bushfires of that year. And then Kevin Rudd, of course, famously in 2006 in opposition, pledged to increase Australia's aid to 0.5% of gross national income. The UN target is 0.7, so it's too difficult to get that, but we can do 0.5 by the end of the third term Labor government. This was back in 2006 in opposition, so this was looking out to 2015. And then probably to the surprise of his cabinet colleagues, he did actually move to implement that and a turbocharged AusAid, which had been a boutique agency up until then, to becoming a trajectory for a super agency. and it expanded a lot. There was a lot of critique and questioning. Was it capable of delivering on this increased budget expenditure? But I think certainly by 2012, 2013, there'd been significant investment in capacity, and that AusAid was functioning very, very effectively. However, there was a very strong critique from the opposition. Julie Bishop, who used to smile and get on very well publicly with Kevin Rudd, behind the scenes, there were hatchet jobs from Daily Telegraph and the Oz every 3 months, questions in the Senate by Erica Betts and others. And basically the reputation of AusAid and managing the aid program is diminished because of those media political attacks. And then subsequently, when they came to power, AusAid was abolished, and BFAT and the aid program were integrated. But I think we're really now seeing the fruits of that integration a decade later, where we've got the Office of the Pacific and a much more coherent approach where aid is really subordinated to the foreign policy objectives, but certainly much more integrated and arguably effective on that level. Interestingly, Scott Morrison, when he did Pacific Step Up some years later, in 2018-19, he didn't do what other Prime Ministers had done when they were harnessing to a national security objective or a national interest objective. He didn't increase the aid program. He basically drew down on other parts of the program, shore up funding in the Pacific. And this stood in stark contrast to Howard, but also I forgot to mention Kevin Rudd, having promised 0.5 bolted on a Security Council seat. And that's really what drove the geostrategic growth of Australia's aid program under the Rudd-Gillard government. Ironically, it was Julie Bishop who got to enjoy that in New York. And then finally, the big increase in the last few years was the temporary targeted measures of the coalition in 2020, 21 to tackle COVID, both globally in the region. $1.4 billion were given over the forwards by the coalition. And I think, interestingly, 300 million of that wasn't to do with COVID. It was actually the Mekong countries to partner with the US and other allies on managing downstream effects of Chinese dam building on the Mekong countries. So there again, you can see the national interest at play. Penny Wong, when she came in as foreign minister, she had quite spectacularly attacked the coalition in opposition. As you might remember, Sogavare signed an agreement with the PRC, an MOU, and so there was a big media kerfuffle about we're losing the Solomons, it's falling to the Chinese, the PRC sphere of influence. And so Wong, in opposition with Pat Conroy, announced that there would be 500 million for the Pacific from Labor, subsequently 470 million for Southeast Asia, but both over 4 years. Then, in October 2022, in the latest first mini budget, they basically did something that probably only a former finance minister, Penny Wong, in the Rudd-Gillard government could do. She secured the temporary targeted measures being permanent from Chalmers and Gallagher. So that has been a substantial boost into ongoing expenditure, and then the Labor promises on top of that. So that's where we're sort of at the moment with the trajectory. But you can see that really aid goes up when there is a sort of a national interest imperative. So just to repeat, and this is probably Alan's turf more, but there's been an interesting addition of indexation for a decade to the budget 2 years ago, and then the second budget. And the key thing is, though, as a proportion of the annual federal budget, which is over $650 billion a year, the aid program is 0.68%. So it's less than 1% of our total annual federal budget, which I'll come back to. The conventional measure for measuring aid is GNI, gross national income, and that 0.7 target. As I mentioned, We were 14th in the OECD Donors Club in 2015. Currently, we are 26, and I know Pat Conroy has made quite a concern. Well, the Europeans are now including refugee costs, domestic refugee costs in their aid program. But our friends over at ANU at the Development Policy Centre have calculated that, and we climb up to 24. So we're sort of hanging around with Slovenia and Greece. You can see us there. Oh no, we're below Slovenia. But we are the 13th largest economy in the world. So for a country that likes to punch above its weight, we're very underdone. Now, this is not of Labor's making. It's a long history, of course, and they were very vociferous critics of coalition's aid cuts. But I think, notwithstanding that they incorporated the coalition's temporary aid increases, we've yet to see anything from Labor in power to substantially repair the damage that was done. So ACFID represents 130 Australian charities working in international development. Some work with Indigenous communities as well. Some are very large global federations, household names that you know, like the Oxfam, so Australian Red Cross. Some are very specialised in certain areas and well known as well, like Fred Hollows and iHealth. Others work simply in certain issues, like Hagar in trafficking. Others work just in some countries in teacher education in Cambodia, for example. But collectively, they represent an incredible effort by citizens to organise and connect with others in the world and do work. And Heath and I were talking about an organisation, a member of ACFID that he's involved with, the Nusa Tenggara Association that works in eastern Indonesia in water and sanitation and agricultural extension work. And so there's the great and the good on their boards, and the majority of funding comes from the Australian public. 1.8 billion a year. And it's the opposite of our domestic social service cousins who get most of their funding from state and federal service contracts in the various sectors they work in. DFAT provides 17%, sometimes 16% of funding to our members. The majority is coming from over 40% from donations and philanthropy, corporate payroll giving and the like, as well as other donors in other parts of the world or in the region. There's a large geographical presence. They have Australia's diplomatic presence with these Australian organisations. 3/4 of our members primarily work through local partners in the countries they're working in, those 85 countries. So they're partnering with other civil society organisations, government, local government, private sector and the like. And there's a lot of volunteers that are involved in these organisations. And the majority of funding that is raised goes to programs. And that's too hard to see, but we'll send the PowerPoint. We've got the PowerPoint, so we'll send this around afterwards. But the majority is going to programs in Africa. So it's 194 million. And in Southeast Asia, it's 262 million. So the composition of the sources of funding changes. So in the Pacific, there is more DFAT funding going through ACFID's members, through the NGOs. It's about 50-50. And then when you come to Africa, it's primarily public donations as opposed to, because there is no substantial funding except for humanitarian and a little bit of residue of scholarships in Africa. Something that Matthew and I and others are currently chipping away at. So what we do is we organise all of that donor data from our members. So they have 1.1 million donors, and we break it down by electorate, and then we go and lobby parliamentarians every year before budget with our member CEOs. We go and meet all the politicians, we brief DFAT, we'll have a series of policy asks, what we're asking for around the overall funding envelope, and then some policy proposals. And we're lobbying for the government's aid program of the day. So our view is that the government's aid program is a global public good. It's different. We give a nod to national interest, and so we'll talk more about it in a minute. But essentially, we see that this is something that Australia should be doing more and better on, and we want to see build a constituency. So some of our members are funded by the Gates Foundation. Save Children takes parliamentarians out to visit aid programs in different countries in our part of the world, further afield in Africa. Each year, there'll be several trips where we take them out to basically sensitise them and educate them. It's something the Defence Department do as well, of course, with politicians, but there's not a specific program that the department runs to look at aid per se. We put our policy proposals around what we want to see. We'll be doing that for the coming election, and then the framing is quite interesting. So probably 5 years ago, we felt that we were struggling with our language around Australia's obligations on the Sustainable Development Goals that had signed up. So we brought former senior diplomats and defence security people together, Alan Gingell, Brendan Sargent, Melissa Connolly-Tyler, who used to work here, and basically said, well, what's your starting point for aid? How do you see it? And so it was quite a useful exercise because there was a lot of energy and there was a strong critique of Australian statecraft at that point in time. And so it was a desire to basically work together. So for us, that was really helpful because what we saw by collaborating was people like Alan Gingell in their public commentary started to give much more reference to the own goal of the aid cuts under the Abbott Hockey government in 2014, but also we start to frame our arguments much more around the need to have all tools of statecraft in a very complex geostrategic set of circumstances, and development being a substantial part of DFAT's budget, 2/3 of it being critical to that. And so we wanted to see its status lift from the poor cousin that it was to much more of an equal partner. And so AP4D was a program that was funded by Defence subsequently. And it's been very, very successful, producing lots of think pieces. But some of the rhetoric and the messaging in it around all tools of statecraft are needed, a whole of nation approach. These are not new to diplomats, but what happened was that speechwriters of ministers and shadows took these papers up and started using this rhetoric. So development was elevated a lot more. So that's the frame that ACFID uses. We still use SDGs. We still use that publicly will be critical, that the government needs to, get off the bottom of the league table in DAC donors. But we can start to see that some of this language is being used by them, and that we feel is a little bit of defence, that framing against future potential cuts. I noticed Mr. Dutton said that there's going to be 100 million taken from unspecified areas of savings under a Dutton government this week. So we have to be alert that aid traditionally is seen as an ATM for the treasurers. And that's just the framing that we're going to be using in the coming election. So we're going to be going out and saying that the next government needs to get to 1% of federal budget in its aid expenditure, which is about an extra $2.5 billion. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alan now to give a little bit of an overview of the development policy framework that the government's adopted, and give that sort of political outline, and to talk about what we would like to see in the city. Thank you.
Hello, yes, good evening, everyone. So, let's get through a few of these. To a little bit about Australia's current international development policy and what it is that Australia has said that it would like to achieve through that development policy. So just last year, about exactly 1 year ago, in August 2023, the first substantive international development policy in a decade was released. And it's in that year, there's been a number of things that have happened. A few of the strategies that are sitting under that policy are still being developed, and ACFID has made some, with our members, has tried to make some input to those policies around humanitarian, some international gender equality strategy, international disability equity strategy, and also engagement with LGBTQI rights strategy as well. Those are all still to come. It's also a couple of the development partnership plans sit under that policy, both for Papua New Guinea and for Indonesia have both been released, and see the other development partnership plans as they continue to come out. The key objective of the strategy, as it says, is to advance an Indo-Pacific that is peaceful, stable, and prosperous. If you look back 10 years at the 2014 development policy, the objective then was to promote prosperity, reduce poverty, and enhance stability with an Indo-Pacific focus. So we've been very consistent over the last 10 years in what the objective of Australia's international development policy is to achieve. But one of the noteworthy things about the new international development policy is that climate change is a focus, both as a driver of instability in the region, but also as a challenge for our times. The Pacific as an existential threat that's affecting our region. So there's both a strong focus on climate change, including a new target to analysing climate risk at a country level as part of the international development policy. It also puts a really strong focus on working in partnerships and a really strong focus on local development. That's one of the things that really comes out is that the policy commits Australia to supporting local development and to channeling power of this development program into the hands of local actors. So it's just where the policy sits in terms of the other things that have changed in the development performance framework. We have the international development policy sitting there and a number of development partnerships plans sitting under that. Those have been consulted for the last while, and as I said, we've seen both PNG and the Indonesia development partnership plan come out very recently. I expect to see a number of the rest now. Probably all of them will be in the out. I believe they're due in November. So we'll see more coming out before then. One of the other things that's happened is there's a lot more focus on the reporting side as well. There's an annual performance and development performance of Australian Development Cooperation Report, the PADC report. The first one of which came out this year in a few months back. I think it was in June. That's come out, and that focuses on the year before the international development policies come in. So it's not looking at specific indicators that come out of the international development policy, but looks at what we've done in the year before. And there's also an online data portal, which is slated to come in by December this year, and it's to provide a bunch of information about all of Australia's aid investments. So that's very welcome. This year, the IATI, the International Aid Transparency Institute, released their Published Budget Fund report, and Australia was ranked 4 in that report. In fact, of the 50 organisations that looked at, DFAT ranked only 3 up from the bottom. So only the Chinese Development Agency and Spain's Development Agency were ranked lower on aid transparency than Australia, which is a big drop from there from last year. And to give some context around that, Australia simply stopped reporting the IATI in 2019. Stopped reporting data. And as a result, they had no data to rank Australia on. There was a small dump of data that was released just before they published the report, which is all they had to look at. But yeah, Australia ranked for the first time. So hopefully the intention is with this online data portal that we reported on the online data portal and also to IATI at the same time. So that should back up. But certainly a blemish on Australia's international development reputation for this year. So one of the key things that the international development policy does talk about is a focus on locally led development, supporting local leadership and encouraging local participation in all of our Australian development investments. And that's fantastic. That's very welcome. We all know that. Locally led development is what you need to have a good development program. It's an uncontested statement. And the policy commits to that idea of providing flexible core funding to local civil society actors, to local NGOs. And that's one of those things that will really enable local actors to build their capacity and to be able to lead on development investments and to drive their own development. So yeah, it's a great thing. And one of the things that has also come out following that international development policy is the guidance note on local development, which has been developed by DFAT. It is fantastic. It's a great document. A lot of the things that are in there are very key to making a locally led development work. It talks about how we need to ensure that we are co-creating development investments with local actors and having local actors provide real input to that co-creation. It doesn't go so far as to say that is something that must happen with all development investments. That's certainly still sitting out there. But it is a fantastic document that does talk about that. If it has one weakness, it's a little bit in the monitoring that sits behind how we look at local led development. Some of the key indicators we're looking at include things like how many local staff are engaged in development projects. And while that's a great thing and is great to have local staff involved in development projects, it certainly doesn't look at how the local actors are leading on development initiatives, and it also bringing local staff into a number of development projects can result in them being drawn, skilled staff being drawn out of local government and local society actors instead of working in infrastructure projects that are invested in by the Australian government. So there's a little bit there still to work on, but local development is definitely a positive. It's a big push for the international development policy, and something that Australia looks to be doing some really good moves on. So why local-led development? Why is this an important thing? At its heart, local-led development is about placing power in the hands of the communities, so that communities can address their own development needs. And I guess as a development practitioner, it's a bit of reflecting on some of what we have done in the past, or done in agencies that I've worked for, is not racist. There's certainly some aspects of development work that has resulted in Western practitioners saying that we know the best, we can solve communities' problems with the sort of bold standard approaches that we have. So at its heart, localization is about transferring that power and doing better in our development. It's also about, I guess, acknowledging some of the shortfalls of the development narrative. We talk about the extreme poverty line, which is USD 215 a day, and while that certainly sounds in some contexts like that's a poverty line, if you get over that, you'll have sufficient money to live. That's a poverty line that applies across the world. So that's USD 215 a day in the US or in Australia, and certainly those of us at the global north would not consider that to be an amount of money that you could live on. So we do expect developing or the global south to bear the brunt of international inequality. And so at its heart, localization is about trying to address, I guess, those ideas that we've captured and put into the development system, and trying to change those. But localization is also about efficiency and effectiveness. Addressing local development change with local solutions is imperative for efficient way to solve problems. And it's not a single bullet that resolves all of the difficulties with development. Certainly there are power relations within communities, issues of gender equality, issues of discrimination against socioeconomic individuals within communities. So localization doesn't necessarily take into account those power dynamics as well. It's about engaging diverse representatives of communities to make sure that we are genuinely taking account of unequal power relations within the communities, as well as between ourselves and the communities that we work with. So to bring, I guess, the development program a little bit specific and talk about specific development, and certainly Australia's development program is focused on the Pacific. About $2 billion of the 4.9 billion aid budget is slated to be delivered in the Pacific. It's one of those areas that has received bipartisan support as being the region where Australia could provide international development assistance. So yeah, just look at human development needs in the Pacific. The needs do remain significant. There's a number of indicators there on the board, but in terms of the economic, 1 in 4 Pacific Islanders live under their national poverty line. In terms of gender equality, women's leadership across the region, certainly not always something that's it's being promoted. In Vanuatu, there's one woman parliamentarian, which is a member of parliament, and in PNG we have 3 women, 188 seat national parliament. In terms of health outcomes as well, non-communicable diseases account for 70% of the deaths in the Pacific. And data around infant mortality there as well. We've got the 2022 UNICEF data for PNG, which has infant mortality in PNG as being 41.4 deaths per 1,000 live births, which when you contrast with Australia at the same time, which is 3.8 deaths per 1,000 live births. There's certainly some large human development needs in the Pacific still. So how do we respond to the Pacific priorities? We can see that some of the Pacific priorities have been captured in the 2050 strategy for the Pacific, which was developed by the Pacific Island Forum, obviously very topical at the moment. Unsurprisingly, climate change is one of the key areas that the strategy for the Pacific says is a Pacific priority. But another one of them is also embracing good governance and promoting democratic principles. And so quite pulled out there. But I guess that's one of Australia's key points of difference as a diet, is that we do attempt to do local development. We do attempt to listen to the priorities of the public. We try to listen to, value, and respond to Pacific actors when they tell us that climate finance is what they're seeking and that they want support for civil society across the Pacific to promote good governance. So one of the key things that ACFID is asking for is certainly support for Pacific civil society. Unsurprisingly, as a civil society body ourselves. And we can see that civic space is shrinking both globally and in the Pacific. Civicus, which is a global monitor that tracks civic space, has noted some concerns in the Pacific. In 2023, journalists in PNG and Samoa faced intimidation. And in 2022, 5 countries in the Pacific disrupted protest activities. Media organizations were harassed in Solomon Islands, and Kiribati suspended judges. So one of the key ways that we can try to protect that civic space is to support civil society actors and to support them through development activities. Doing that, and also look to forward people connections across the Pacific. Use safeguards of that geostrategic competition that Australia is also seeking to engage in the Pacific. And we've got a number of steps there that Australia can take to support civil society in the Pacific. But I guess just to quickly look at ACFID and our members, this is just those members who are accredited with the ANCP, but this is a list of the partnerships they have with civil society across the region. And then the underneath is an average of the length of time that they've held a partnership. So there's 60 civil society partnerships with civil society actors that Australian NGOs have in Papua New Guinea, an average length of partnership of 15 years. So the rest of us is there as well.
How are we going, gentlemen?
I think we're ready to take some questions.
Okay, thank you. So we will turn to questions now. If I could ask people to identify themselves and speak loudly for the microphone. I might just get the ball rolling, if I may. As you've identified, the Pacific is the topic of the week, and I'm just wondering how Australia's development program can promote democracy and transparency in that part of the world. You've spoken about localization. What sort of role is there for leading by example on the part of Australian ODA, but also activities by Australian NGOs in conveying the benefits or otherwise of democracy?
Helen, do you want to give the glass half full about what we could do with standards and so on, and I'll give the glass half empty?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, one of the key ways that, ACFID is a member of PIANGA, which is the Pacific Island Association of NGOs, and sort of a big body of big bodies of Pacific Island NGOs, including ACFID and also New Zealand's big body of NGOs. And we have worked with PIANGA to develop, PIANGA has developed a Pacific accountability framework, which is certainly similar in some ways to the ACFID Code of Conduct. It looks at what civil society actors can do to to bring that accountability and standards up. And they're looking for support to spread that across the Pacific and to have that taken up by members and all NGOs across the Pacific. But the things like supporting those frameworks and that accountability within the Pacific can really help to increase civil society actors' ability to participate in budgetary processes and government processes around the region and to promote democracy. I mean, those sorts of the accountability framework can help to mean that Pacific civil society actors will have the structures and procedures in place to be able to absorb more donor funding. That's a way that DFAT can directly, or the Australian government can directly fund civil society actors, acknowledging that there's some issues with managing a large number of very small contracts there, but by doing that, be able to reach the standards that the DFAT has set for that funding, but also that by taking up those standards, you're better able to engage with the government on their budgetary processes and how they're doing what they're doing financially, and be able to protect civic space, protect democracy.
So I think there's opportunities there. The tension lies in what Paul Keating, is critiqued as the groupthink in the policy establishment that, sitting the public version of the development policy, of course, has a classified version sitting behind it, and it's very much driven by countering China's influence. So some of the choices that Australia's making over the last 5 or 6 years have definitely shifted practice of the previous 20 years. So, for example, we've got into the business again of doing direct budget support with our neighbours in the Pacific, which we wouldn't have done in the past because of concerns about malfeasance. We are lending after for many years critiquing the debt burdens of Pacific small island states by taking on loans from the PRC. Now, we're saying, well, we're doing this better and more effectively, and maybe we are. But the challenge, I think, is because everything's been cast in a very kind of a dichotomy of this is a contest for influence with very, in some cases, venal leaders in certain countries between PRC and Australia and its allies. It makes it very hard to see us championing transparency, anti-corruption measures, pro-democracy measures. So if there was a coup in Fiji, again, it's hard to imagine that we would sanction the coup maker in the way that we did back in 2006, because we would be the imperative would be to court that coup maker into remaining in our sphere of influence and not going off and getting some largesse from the PRC. So that's the dynamic that we're in. So we're in a Cold War dynamic, and that's very challenging. And I think Australia is not as confident in funding activities in the democracy, transparency space that perhaps the US is.
Okay, thank you. You might just move your chair a bit closer now.
Sure.
All right, questions. Yeah, yes, Colin. And then,
Yes. Colin Maslin. I'm now retired, but I have a question about the DFAT merger. I happen to have been in Afghanistan when that merger was taking place. Now, one of your earlier slides where you showed the development budget, where it peaks in around 2012, 13, 13. My question is, and I think it was a figure of about 2.6 billion. Anyway, is that just purely aid money, or did that also include the administrative costs associated with the agency itself? In other words, AusAid.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think this is going to go backwards, is it? No, so okay, but I was going to get the slide you're referring to. But so Abbott and Hockey famously on my ETHO 2014 said they were taking $1 billion from the aid program per year. So it was a $5 billion aid program, and it dropped to $4 billion. And so there was about 3 years of running programs, ending programs across the board. But from memory, it was 70% cuts to programs in Africa, 40% to multilaterals, and 40% to Southeast Asia, and 30% to multilaterals, and the Pacific was left untouched. I think it didn't include administration, because what happened with integration, as I recall, is that positions were kind of morphed into generalist positions under Peter Voges, and he said that everyone's a generalist, everyone could do diplomacy, everyone can do development, and so the FTE went into DFAT positions, and it wasn't like for like. There was a lot of loss of development administrative spend. So I don't work in the system, so I'm probably garbling it, but I think Voges got a lot of benefit from it and redistributing the AUS8 FTE throughout the department for non-development functions. But then they did lose $1 billion subsequently a year later and a year on after that, years on after that. So that would have impacted. But generally, there was an atrophy in capacity across the board in development functions. And so the result was outsourcing to companies increased and went from about 19% to 25% of the program. And it tends to be dominated by 4 large multinational players who took the former AUS8 staff into doing the design and implementation. So it was outsourced, but much more. That was accentuated. And some of those other core functions around transparency that Alan mentioned basically just withered away over time. So when Labor came to power, the design team and DFAT for at that point was, I think, a $4.5 billion program. There was 4 people. So, I was like, that would have been a much larger capacity, and there was much more agency over, the design, the development, the implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation of the program. And I'm still reliant on contracting and so on, but our critique, certainly that what Labor came into power doing with the capability review of its development policy, was to rebuild DFAT capabilities and to increase the admin spend. So this last budget, not the budget before last, was 36 million for staffing, just to increase the development capabilities. But that's from an outsider's perspective, because I don't really understand how that administrative composition works. But
Okay. So we had a question at the back there.
Evening, guys. Thank you, Richards. So you mentioned before that the Department of Defence contributes to international development, even though it's have a foreign aid program. Knowing that foreign aid sits under DFAT, what more do you think the Department of Defence could be doing?
So one of the other things that happened that is really the aid cuts is that other government departments spend on delivery of qualifiable ODA. So this was mostly in the form of technical assistance. That's the Attorney General sending over people to the Indonesian Department of Justice and the like. Also with it, it didn't drive completely. But with defence, they're commonly used in humanitarian crises, and there's a sort of series of doctrine around how they operate in both an emergency, humanitarian emergency, or in a more protracted crisis, like in Timor-Leste in 2006, or the troubles in the Solomons, which is known as CIVMIL or CIMIC in military speak. But they won't count that as ODA. And DFAT and the current minister, are very keen to try and count the defence spend as part of the total Australian contribution. But unless the OECD DAC, of which Australia is a member, the Development Assistance Community, changed the measurement criteria to include defence spending, for sending Hercules over and so on, that counting is not aid. It's not ODA eligible, although it is an Australian contribution. Defence is very good, of course, in disasters and that logistical deployment. But I think also the current view in the leadership is they'd rather stick to their defence knitting and not have to do this if the department and its partners could do it instead.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, thank you for interesting lecture today. My name is Paolo Troyan. I'm from Ukrainian embassy. Actually, my question is aid to Ukraine and, for example, for Gaza is also included in these figures you mentioned, or is it some kind of separate aid?
No, it's included in those figures. So within that 4.9 billion is the spend on humanitarian. There's two, I guess, buckets of money that humanitarian draws from. One is the humanitarian emergency fund, which is 150 million annually. So that's unallocated through the year. And so if things come up, it's drawn directly from there and announced by the minister. And there's also a larger productive crisis fund that sort of covers what was planned.
And there was a specific allocation for Ukraine early on in the crisis of ODA, as I recall, but I can't remember the exact amount.
And it came from that
And if
humanitarian.
I may, the second question, well, there is an allocated budget for each year or for several years, but if crises arise, for example, huge crisis, some war, can more money be allocated by some decision of the government? Is it regular practice?
Yeah, a fresh appropriation can be made and more money can be out.
And this is a key campaign call we've been arguing for since the government came to power, that when they came to power, we initiated a campaign called Help Fight Famine because there was risk of acute food insecurity in the Horn of Africa and Yemen and Afghanistan. And to your question, in the past, Australia used to fund multi-year funding for protracted crises. So it still does with the Rohingya in Bangladesh or Myanmar, but allocations in Iraq and Syria, Yemen, they tapered off under the coalition government and became ad hoc, stopped in some cases. So we argued Australia needed to get back in the game, start contributing multilaterally and to multi-year, particularly because of this famine. The initial point was, well, we're focused on the Pacific. We can't do that, can you? Then we kept chipping away, lobbying, and they said, well, so there's food insecurity in the Pacific. Could we do something there? We said, yeah, but people are dying in Horn of Africa. And then to their credit, they did in 22-23, 3 tranches totaling $69 million. And then our call has been to double the humanitarian emergency fund of 150 million to 300 million because there are such demands upon it from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from Gaza. So historically, that fund has been targeted at Pacific for cyclones, and then at the end of the financial year, what is left over, they allocate multilaterally, globally. But we think we're very underdone. The last time that fund increased was in 2018. Thank you.
All right. Yes, Desmond.
This month, the Rotary Club of Canberra, the Rotary Club of Honiara, Rotary Club of Baldwin and Melbourne are getting together to provide funding to do something about the situation at the National Referral Hospital in Honiara. Currently, they have a serious potable water problem. Electricity is not guaranteed in Honiara, and therefore pumps don't always work to move the water. The water is not filtered when it does arrive. The old system of rainwater tanks on the roof has collapsed and no maintenance. So you've got a situation where there is non-potable water being used all the time in the hospital. The fly screens are no longer operational, so there are malarial carrying mosquitoes buzzing around the hospital, infecting patients who come in for treatment. My question is, what exactly would the Sogavare government's Minister of Health have been doing for the last several years in ignoring this problem, which is inside the city that he lives in? And why would you think that funding infrastructure for the South Pacific Games was a more important priority than doing something so obvious for a sum so trivial that Rotary in Australia can help out?
Good questions. And I can't really, we can only speculate on the Minister for Health in Solomon. So but to the Australian government DFAT, as Alan mentioned, they're currently developing partnership plans. Solomon's is yet to come out, but they come down to, as always with these strategies, a series of choices, and there'll be some existing programs that continue. There'll be a current contextual analysis, so what are the needs? But I think the real risk at the moment is that security imperatives skew or influence the choices that are being made. So we have no problem with the recent budget, the announcement of a deep sea telecommunications cable being rolled out for Tuvalu, for example, as has been done with Solomons as well. But when you've got health systems crumbling, not just in Solomons and Honiara, but Port Vila General Hospital is 1,000 person FTE hospital. It has only 200 positions filled. So there are real needs in post-COVID in investment in shoring up the health systems in across the Pacific. And we'll have to look at those development partnership plans to see what choices are being made. What requests have come in from partner governments, of course, who will always want infrastructure of certain kinds as a priority. That's understood. But it's workforce as well as that infrastructure, it's workforce training. Because I don't know about Solomons PNG, the workforce is ageing. So we have real concerns that the development priorities, the development fundamentals may be being lost in this geopolitical competition. And we're going to have to look at DPPs case by case, see what the investments are. But what you've indicated in Honiara and the hospital would be a surefire sign that not only as the Minister for Health in the Solomons not had his eye on the ball, but also perhaps whatever the development staff have been raising up at the posts there is not being listened to in DFAT.
I will take two questions, and I'm going to, is it Lauren? Could you have a question, and then John, and then we'll have to call the quits.
That's great. My name's Lauren. I'm from the British High Commission in Canberra in the Pacific Development Unit. You've met my boss, Mary. I just wondered if you have reflections on donor coordination in the Pacific and whether you think Australia might be able to play a greater role and what that might look like. And if your answer would be partners in the Pacific, how we might improve that so that it really is coordinating things.
Yeah, and John, do you want to get yours in there?
Oh, yeah. I just wondered, Mark, if has any information on broad public opinion towards development assistance as a good way of spending federal money? Is there a Lowy question or anything like that on that? I mean, the argument is there are no votes in foreign aid.
Yeah, sure. So look, on donor coordination, I think it really is important to listen to Pacific partners and the Pacific Island Forum and also civil society voices, because they will be having maybe some counter narratives. What I hear from talking to diplomats here when they talk about engagement with DFAT, and this is not a critique, it's just it reflects what I've been saying, the dominant imperatives are around can you come on board around infrastructure, cybersecurity, lending, and obviously there is a role, but I think it's looking at the complementarities. If Australia is covering that lending for infrastructure and telecommunications, then maybe Britain could play more in the transparency, shoring up democracy, women's voting rights, representation, as a complement to what Australia is not doing. On polling and voting, so we've just completed some polling, qualitative research with Consamaris, who's a Victorian pollster, Redbridge, and to test public attitudes for aid as we gear up for our new campaign, Save the World for All. And I think the key thing that we found in the polling, which differs from Lowy's annual polling, which strangely didn't include aid this year, I don't know why, or not, I couldn't see it when I looked, and DFAT's own research, which looks very much at the status quo, we're interested in change. And so what it was telling us is basically public messaging around the total quantum. If we say there's a $4.9 billion aid program, you have a choice, that's a hell of a lot of money, so well, that's enough. As you probably all know in this audience, polling and Lowy in the past has sort of said that public impression of what aid is 10% of the federal budget. What I showed before is 0.68, 1%. So what they showed is across all demographics, if we point out that 0.68 of the percent, and that we're trying to get to 1%, basically neutralises it as a spending issue that is competing with other areas of public expenditure. Of course, public want better health, education, roads here, and that's their priority. And if they see that aid is a competitor, their vote and their attitudes swing towards, well, charity begins at home, that's where we need to focus. If it's presented as we want 1% of the federal budget each year to be spent on aid, basically say, yeah, fair enough, it should be that, we're underdone. And if you add, that we're at the bottom of the league ladder in donors as well, they say, yeah, we need to lift our game. And that's what we'll be running with when we invite candidates to election forums. We're doing in marginal seats with our members in the federal election in Sydney and Melbourne, and also here in Canberra in the next 6 months or so.
Well, I think we might draw a line under it there. Thank you very much. Time has elapsed. I think everyone will agree with me that the wealth of experience that both Mark and Alan bring with them tonight has shown through in a very informative set of presentations and replies to questions. So, on behalf of the ACT branch of the AII, I'd like to present you with some tokens or mementos of your coming. Alan and